Kindly note that the views and opinions shared in this video are those of the speaker and do not constitute advice given by Classic Private Wealth. Any advice given by Classic Private Wealth will be in writing in the form of a wealth management proposal. Classic Private Wealth is an authorized financial services provider.
What I'm going to do today is just kind of try to put what's happening around us into a bit of context. This talk has taken on a bit of a life of its own. We're doing it on a weekly basis. The first hour is really supposed to be about setting the general scene and kind of talking about how it works. So it's really for people who haven't been to the talk before. So those who want to listen again, obviously very welcome, but please bear with me if I repeat some things that you've heard before. Obviously, as things move along, it will be slightly different from what it was 4 weeks ago. But also then what we'll do is at 9:30, we'll actually have half an hour on where markets are standing and what's new and what's the so that's really intended for people who are keeping up to date rather than people joining us for the first time. So in this first bit, I'm going to first of all just talk about the virus and the epidemiology of it, and then actually talk about the economic consequences of the lockdowns that we've experienced and the prospects for further lockdown or not, and then a little bit about markets and how markets have reacted to this, and kind of explaining what we think the reason for the market reactions. So let's start with the virus. We've got a virus that is extremely contagious. And it becomes contagious apparently about 5 days before you present with symptoms. And now they're saying that it's probably still contagious about 3 to 5 days after your symptoms have abated. So actually people can walk around and feel quite healthy and be infecting a lot of other people. And it's actually more so than normal flu or cold viruses. So actually something that is more contagious than flus or colds. So that makes it quite difficult to deal with, because it's then very, very difficult to contain such a virus, because if you say to everyone who presents with symptoms that they need to isolate themselves, that's too late. They've already spread the virus. Now, in terms of virology, they're using an R number. If that number is larger than 1, it means that every person who gets infected infects more than one other person, which means that the virus keeps spreading and the epidemic keeps getting larger. If you can get that R number under 1, the virus, you actually, the contagion gets contained, so the epidemic eventually will cease. So in epidemiology, it's quite important to watch the R number. Hi, Oscar. What happens in this epidemiology is then also the second thing that's very important is the number of people who die. So what happens is that if you have something like a cold or a flu where a very low percentage of people die of it, then you basically let it run through your population, or you try to take some measures to contain it, but if people are dying. But if too many people start dying, you have to take extraordinary measures. So if you have Ebola or SARS or something like that, you take extraordinary measures to contain it, because a lot of people will die from it if they get it. Now, just to give you an idea, roughly 0.1% of people who get the flu die of it every year. So we have a situation where people die of flu or the complications of flu on an annual basis, and it's mostly old and vulnerable people who die of flu, but roughly 0.1%. So that's the kind of starting point. So if people say this is just a bad flu, what they mean is that maybe 0.2 or 0.3% of people will die of it. because we're actually losing some people to flu every year anyway. But what we still do with flu is we try to contain it because of the deaths. So even the 0.1 is enough to trigger an effort to contain it. And what people do is they vaccinate. And what you do is you vaccinate medical workers and vulnerable people to make sure that you don't get too many fatalities from the flu and that you don't spread it unnecessarily. And with flu also, there's some resistance in the general population. So even though the flu will always mutate a little bit, so there'll be a new strain of flu typically every year, and sometimes it's a more difficult strain, but typically you try to contain those things, even though only 0.1% of people die. Now what you've got is you've got a new virus, so there is no vaccine. Normally vaccines take 5 to 7 years to develop, apparently. Okay, I was off for a couple of seconds, so let me just actually go back to where we were. We've got a new virus. There's no resistance in the community, and there is also no vaccine and no treatment for it. So what we need to do is we need to fall back on the kind of measures that were used 100 years ago for the 1918 flu, because normally if we get most illnesses, medical science has some kind of remedy for us. At this point, medical science has no sure remedies for us, so we need to take other measures. Now, in this, the coronavirus affects older people much worse than younger people. So what we see is that if you're looking at the populations of older than 80, you have somewhere between a 10% and a 20% mortality rate for people contracting the virus. So it's very, very deadly in old people. And what this means is that governments will take severe action to try to limit the spread of this virus. So initially, when we started off with the virus, we were still doubtful as to the reaction of various governments. What we see is that virtually all governments in the world will take some measures to try to contain the virus. And most people will actually go into a fairly strict lockdown, meaning what they will do is they will try to keep people from getting into contact with each other. So in the US, they talk about shelter in place. In South Africa, we just talk about lockdown. And effectively what it means is try to get into as little contact as possible with other people so that you don't contract the virus, but also so that you don't spread the virus. One of the controversies throughout has been what is the use of face masks. What we see is that Asian countries have a tradition of wearing face masks. Western countries, not so much. But even in the Western countries, they are now saying, please wear face masks because it actually helps you from spreading the virus. So face mask is apparently not very effective at protecting you, but it's actually quite effective at making sure that you don't spread the virus. So it spreads through droplets. If you don't spread the droplets, then you're containing the spread of the virus. Now, in this lockdown story, there are basically countries fall into three categories. The first category are the countries that say there's a massive problem elsewhere. Let us quickly go into lockdown to prevent the virus from spreading in our country. So New Zealand, for instance, falls into that category. Taiwan, Singapore, and so on falls into that category. So those countries have been very successful at making sure they don't even get an initial epidemic where a significant number of people die. So you can prevent the virus from spreading into your country by locking down very early. We've seen that. And we know that the strict lockdown then works to keep the virus under control. Then you get a second kind of country that doesn't lock down before they get their own epidemic, but then actually go into fairly strict lockdown. And what we see is the more virulent the epidemic in a specific country is, the more likely they are to go into a very strict lockdown. So what we see is places like Italy, France, Spain, the United States, Britain, all of those countries are countries that didn't lock down in anticipation. They only locked down once the virus had taken hold. And then you get quite a large number of deaths, and you actually get a lot of pressure on the healthcare systems in those countries. So what you see is that in places like France, Spain, and Britain, we're seeing at this stage, we're standing at around 50,000 deaths for each of those countries. In the US, we're now at 80,000 deaths. So if you don't lock down in anticipation, you actually get quite a number of deaths. But if you think about it from a population of the world point of view, we're tracking about 4.5 million confirmed infections, and we're tracking about 500,000 deaths. So effectively, a very small percentage of the world's population has been affected up to now, and a very small number of people relative to the population as a whole has died yet. So we've seen in concentrated spots that quite a large percentage of people, and especially in specific age groups, have died, but overall it's actually very small. Now, to give you a reference, the general estimation is that in the flu of 1918, 50 million people died. So we're now standing at 500,000 people, so maybe 1/100th of the 1918 flu at this stage. So it's certainly not nearly as big a disaster as disasters we have seen in the past. But that really is because we've seen a very small percentage of the world's population infected. And the reason why people like the World Health Organization are so concerned is, if you think about the percentages, the best estimates we have now is that if we don't try to contain it seriously, it will spread through the population very rapidly, and roughly 80% of the population will contract it. Now, normally what you would say is that 60 to 70% of people would contract a normal flu or cold virus that spreads through the population. The reason why this one is likely to be even higher is because there's no pre-existing resistance to it. And therefore, you actually get that it's likely to spread through a very large part of the population. So if you're now thinking of the numbers, if you say there's roughly 7 billion people in the world, 80% of that 7 billion people will get the virus. So maybe 5.5 billion people will contract it. And now you have to say, so what is the mortality once you contract it? And we don't really know, because we don't have accurate figures of how many people have been infected. So we have confirmed infections of 4 million, but if you ask epidemiologists, they will give you a variety of answers, somewhere between 40 and 400 million people that have already been infected, but have not either presented to hospitals or been tested or reported. And there's also reason to believe that in some countries the infections are underreported. So we know there's many, many more people that have been infected, but it's still a very small percentage. So even in New York, where we've now had a fairly serious epidemic, and we've seen roughly 25,000 people die in New York alone, what we see is that in New York City, the estimate is now that roughly 20% of people have been infected, and in New York State as a whole, roughly 15% of people have been infected. So roughly a quarter of the people that could eventually be infected has been infected. So if the virus had spread uncontained, we would have had at least 4 times the number of ill people and at least 4 times the number of deaths. And certainly in New York, the healthcare system was under severe pressure. So the first thing that happens is that governments will say we are trying to flatten the curve, which means that there's a certain capacity to treat people in hospitals. So what happens, the stats that we have about the virus, is that of people who contracted, about 20% will eventually present in hospital. Again, probably because of the lack of testing, it's actually typically a much smaller percentage, but of those who have tested positive, roughly 20% have presented to hospitals. And of that 20%, roughly 5 of the 20 have had to be treated in intensive care. And eventually, if you get ill enough, you get put onto a ventilator. So people do the sums of how many ventilators we have. In South Africa, I think the tally is in the order of 3,000. So we've got 3,000 ventilators in the country. So if you think about 50 million people and you think that 80% will get infected and 20% of those will go to hospital, that already says that you're going to have a situation where you have roughly 8 million people in hospitals. And if 20% of those people have to go into intensive care, you very quickly get to numbers where you know that there's no way that you can accommodate those people in intensive care, and there's no way that you can actually provide everybody who needs a ventilator with a ventilator. Now, again, we know that as part of the treatment, doctors are now saying that they are less likely to put patients onto ventilators. They will just give them additional oxygen. They won't use the ventilators as easily, but still, what we do see is that in places where the healthcare system gets overwhelmed, you have roughly double the death rate that you have in places where hospitals are able to treat patients. So what the governments will do is they'd say, we will flatten the curve, and you will see roughly, and I'm sure all of you have seen this graph somewhere along the line, you will see a graph where there's a kind of very steep a bell curve that says this is what would happen if the virus spread uncontrolled, and then you'll see a less steep bell curve that says this is how we contain it, and the less steep bell curve will come in at below the level of your ability to treat the patients. So this is now called flattening the curve, meaning what we're going to do is we're going to flatten the curve and make sure we've got the capacity to treat most people who get ill, and therefore our mortality rate will be a lot lower. But the basic idea behind this is that the way that you treat the epidemic is to let it spread and to get something called herd immunity, meaning when 60 or 70% of people have been exposed to the virus, then your R number automatically goes below 1 because you're not spreading the virus, because most people you come into contact with have already got some immunity to the virus, and therefore the epidemic fizzles out, if you like. So there you see the red curve. For those of you who are not colorblind, the red curve is without protective measures, so you can see that it's roughly 2 or 3 times the healthcare system capacity. The blue curve comes within the healthcare system capacity. What you will see people saying is that in Britain and America, they have flattened the curve enough so that their healthcare systems didn't get overwhelmed. We know that for small periods of time, the New York healthcare system was pretty much overwhelmed. We know that in places like Italy, even the burial system was overwhelmed. But pretty much the hospitals could cope, and therefore they say we were able to flatten the curve enough to attain this. We'll get back to what the next consequence is. The problem with this picture that you see here is that's actually far from the truth. The reality is the next picture. If we can go to the next picture, we'll see the one with all that one, please. Thank you. There you see that the actual capacity of the system to take care of people is that bottom red line. So if you look at the various curves, you see that all of these curves go to way more than the capacity to treat the same number of people. So effectively, if you allow the spread of the virus into the community uncontrolled, or even if you just try some modest measures to flatten the curve, you can't get under that bottom red line. So that red line just above the zero, that's how many beds we have available. And the surge, the surges are, even when you have quite strict measures, you get onto that blue line, which is the lowest of the bell curves, and that is still way too high. So that's why what we see is that developed countries actually don't come out of lockdown. So if we can go back to the camera, we then see, so what we see is that if we leave things be, then there's an epidemic, and that epidemic kills so many people that governments are forced effectively to lock down. So in New York, in Italy, in Spain, the lockdown only came once there was an epidemic, and that lockdown then needs to last about 2 months in order to get the epidemic under control, and then the new infections and the death starts abating, and those countries then say, but we have flattened the curve, we're on the other side of the curve. The problem on the other side of the curve, of course, and that's also the problem in China, it's the problem in Korea, which has been very successful at flattening the curve, is that you still don't have immunity in the community, and therefore you still can't open up. So if we could go to the Korean number, I think that's actually quite an instructive one. It's a flat curve with a little bump at the beginning. Let's go ahead. Korean one we'll see in a second. Just a moment. Yeah, there we go. If we'll show the Korean curve. So what you see in Korea is that they actually had an emerging epidemic, and then they shut down very effectively, and they brought the curve under control. So what you can see is the new infections went up to just more than 1,000 a day, and now we are in single figures. On the 4th of May, they actually had 3 new infections in South Korea. So South Korea had an epidemic, but they brought it under control extremely effectively with a very severe form of lockdown. Now, the problem that presents itself, of course, is first of all, lockdown brings your economy to a dead standstill. Now, we'll talk about what a dead standstill means, but it severely impacts your economy. So strict lockdown is very difficult to enforce. And even then, there's a big difference between strict lockdown in countries which are developed, first of all. If you are a developed country, your ability to lock down is much more than in a developing country. And the second thing is, if you have a tradition of strict discipline in society, such as in South Korea, that means you are able to enforce very strict lockdown. The same thing that you would say of China. China is pretty much a developed country, and it has a very strong tradition of strict measures and discipline in society, so they're also able to enforce a very strict lockdown. So what you see here is you go through this lockdown period, but then when you get out on the other side, you can't go back to normal. You actually have to maintain some measures because such a small percentage of your population has been exposed to the virus that you can't actually come out the other side. So what you see in a place like South Korea is there's still a fairly strict form of lockdown in Korea. Otherwise, that level of infections will rise again. If you happen to be a small island with a developed economy and you lock down fairly early, you actually have a chance of warding the virus out of your island. So it looks like New Zealand have succeeded in bringing infections down to such a low level that they are now contemplating opening up the whole of New Zealand, actually having rugby with spectators so that you can have large social gatherings, because the only thing you have to do is to keep the virus off the island, meaning you have to be very strict at your ports of entry, and literally ports for trade, etc. But the island on its own can actually start operating pretty much like normal again. But you only open up once that level of infection is virtually zero. So what people are now talking about is no longer flattening the curve, but crunching the curve, meaning we actually go to the level where we virtually eradicate the virus in a specific community and keep it eradicated. And then we can go back to some semblance of normal. Now, I want to, so that's for developed economies. For developing economies, there is a different issue at play. Most developing economies do not have the ability, even if they lock down as strictly as they can, they don't have the ability to crunch the virus. So South Africa, for instance, had a very early lockdown. So we fall in this category of countries that locked down early before there was an epidemic. And that has meant that the epidemic in South Africa has been slow to get started. But even though we had the severest form of lockdown that we could maintain, the virus in our community is still spreading. And I think this is actually an example of what would happen in most countries. So let's just go back to the graph a week ago. So last week we were looking at this graph. And the graph shows total infections in South Africa. And there you will see that we were looking at about 7,000 infections. If we just look at that graph 1 week later, then we see that the 7,000 has been replaced by close on 12,000. So what we're seeing is a rising number of daily infections in spite of lockdown. Now, again, we're not yet 2 weeks after the opening up. We're close to that, but not quite. And what we'll see is the move from level 5 to level 4 would have also allowed more spread of the virus. So we're actually likely to see a significant acceleration of that curve in South Africa. So in essence, you see a second kind of country, India, South Africa, Brazil, Indonesia, etc., probably Turkey and Iran as well in that category, which don't have the ability to keep the epidemic under control through lockdown. Now, what that means is lockdown is far less effective in those countries because eventually the virus will spread. And the only thing you can really say for a lockdown is it buys you some time to get ready from a medical perspective. And in South Africa, you will see that there are now many more intensive care beds available. There are more ventilators. There's more PPE stored up, etc., in order to be able to treat people with the virus. But the idea that we can contain the virus indefinitely is probably not realistic. And you have to say that the government in South Africa has from the start said, we don't think we can contain it. We can only slow it down in order to get ready. So two kinds of countries, the developed countries who lock down either early so they don't really get an epidemic, or they lock down late and they have an epidemic first, but they then get into some kind of suspended state where they have to be taking measures against the virus on an ongoing basis. Otherwise, they will have a resurgence of the virus. So what we're seeing in China and in Korea and so on, those countries that have contained the virus, is that sporadically they get some new cases and they have to have some fairly strict form of lockdown again to make sure that the virus stays under control. So what you see in developed countries is a kind of two-stage thing happening. The first stage is strict lockdown, And that strict lockdown says that everybody who's not essential stays at home, or anybody who can work from home works from home. Now, again, if this happened 20 years ago, very few people would have been able to work at home. And now a lot of people can work at home, so it's actually a lot easier. But what our estimate is that when you go into that strict form of lockdown, roughly 50% of people stop working, and you lose roughly 30% of all production. So GDP shrinks for that period of strict lockdown by about 30%. Now that is massive. It's completely unprecedented. It's not something that we've seen in our lifetimes, and in fact, it's not something that we've seen ever. That level of shrinkage in the economy when you go into a strict lockdown. There are various estimates. We initially estimated that it should be about 30%. The estimates we're getting now is it's somewhere between 20 and 30%, and that typically lasts about 2 to 3 months. So for 2 to 3 months, most countries in the world have been in a very strict period of lockdown. So when you see the figures coming out for the second quarter of 2020, that will be the period when about 2/3 of the world was in strict lockdown. So you're likely to see very large shrinkages in the economy during the second quarter. But then what happens is people start opening up again on the other side of the lockdown, and it's caused by 3 different things. The first thing that happens is you get to the stage where South Korea is, where there are very few infections, so you can just keep it under control with tracing and tracking and testing. You get other countries which kind of open up because they say that we can't really maintain the lockdown for much longer without destroying normal life. So in those countries, you're actually likely to see a resurgence. So a place like Sweden from the start never had a very strict lockdown. It's kind of voluntary. So in Sweden, the virus is still spreading. And we're seeing actually very similar results to some of the countries with lockdown next door to it. But again, it can't relax the lockdown. And the estimate that we had from the start is that in the second phase, you go back to a situation where you're only losing about 10% of GDP. So now if you look at The Economist 2 weeks ago, they had on their front page, the 90% economy. So the general estimate now is you go back to an economy that still loses about 10% of its activity. Now, one of the things that happen is that if you on your own come out of the lockdown, your interaction with the rest of the world is still impeded. So in a country like New Zealand, about 12% of their GDP is tourism. So even if they have no infections on the island, they still can't have tourists coming and going from New Zealand. So about 10% of the economy is still disabled, even if they have normal activity in the rest of the economy. So what we're likely to see is actually quite an extended period worldwide of some form of the 90% economy. Now, the 90% economy doesn't happen in a day. You don't actually just relax your restrictions and the next day all the activity is back, or 80, you go back to 90%. You gradually go back from 80 to 90. You probably bump from 70 to 80 and then gradually go back to 90. And then we think that people will find clever ways to stay safe and operate even when the virus is still prevalent. So maybe the 90% economy gradually moves to becoming a 95% economy, and that very much depends on the level of testing that you're able to do. For countries that can't enforce a strict lockdown, the South Africas and the Indias of the world, you probably go through a period of much higher infection and sickness and death. And that period of illness and death will by itself actually break economic activity quite a lot. So you're likely to go in South Africa, for instance, you'll go from the 70% economy to an 80% economy, but you'll stick in that 80% for a couple of months while a lot of people get ill and a lot of people die. And what will happen in that period when a lot of people get ill and a lot of people die is that a lot of people will voluntarily, of their own accord, try to avoid contact with other people because they will be afraid of getting the virus. So in fact, we think that the emotional content of the lockdown in South Africa will change significantly over the next couple of months, because we'll actually get to a situation where people will no longer say, I'm tired of being forced to lock down. They will say, I'm locking down until the illness has passed. And it looks like the virus in South Africa, the illness will peak somewhere in August or September, which at least will be just after the normal peak of flu infection. So it will not hopefully coincide exactly with the flu. But we're likely to see a lot of ill people and a lot of people dying in South Africa. And it doesn't really matter whether we lock down or not, it will happen anyway. And then what will happen is we will eventually come out on the other side of this by November or December in South Africa with so-called general herd immunity, meaning 60 to 70% of people in the country will have been infected and have either died or recovered. And therefore, there will be immunity and people will be able to get on with their normal lives, except that we will still be in a New Zealand situation then. We will be able to get on with our lives, but we won't be able to trade, we won't be able to have tourists, because no one in the rest of the world will actually want to come to South Africa, because it will be known as one of the places where you very well might acquire the virus. And South Africans certainly won't be welcome anywhere else in the world, because people will be very afraid that we will bring them the virus, because they will still be in stage 2 of the lockdown and trying to keep the virus out of their economies. Now, we will be joined by a couple of countries like Brazil, where the president himself has said there's no use trying to even lock down, but governors in various states have found that they do want to lock down. So there'll be a couple of other countries that does that as well. But effectively, the problem that we face is that, first of all, the world is likely for a fairly long time to be in this 90% state until we actually get some kind of either effective treatment so that we can bring the mortality down, or some kind of vaccine. So there is a lot of work being done on vaccines, and the best case scenario seems to be that there are an approved vaccine by early January, kind of early in the new year, if you like, early in 2021, and that by the middle of the year we have billions of dosages of that, and we can basically inoculate the whole world, and we can bring the virus under control worldwide. So in a best case scenario, we can go back to normality in the second half of 2021. So that's the first problem, is that you still lose about 10% of production even once you come out of your initial strict lockdown. The second thing that we fear might happen is that a lot of countries are now coming out of the lockdown and just saying, we have to come out of the lockdown because it's killing our economy. So we can't wait until we've brought the virus under control. We've got to open our economy up. So there's a lot of that. We're seeing that protests everywhere in the world against lockdown. So some countries will come out of lockdown. It looks like the US is an example of that. And what that will mean from an epidemiological perspective is that it will actually mean that the epidemic will come back. So what we'll see is we'll see many more deaths in a place like the US because of the fact that they're opening up. And it's more than likely that at a local level, at least at state level, they will lock down again, and they will have to go back into strict lockdown, which will be even worse for the economy. So economists, serious economists, are all actually at item that in developed countries, you've got to keep the lockdown in place until you've got very low levels of infection, and then you have to track and trace and test intensively to keep it under control. But we're not seeing that as the actual policy in places like Italy, Spain, and the US. So we're likely to see recurrence from time to time of the strict lockdown. Now, what that means from a business perspective is that the economy goes into a complete tailspin. So a meltdown of the real economy. Activity comes to a grinding halt. And the next problem from an economic point of view is that all the players in the economy have their balance sheets devastated in this process. So typically what you get in any country is that in the strict lockdown phase, about 30% of businesses can continue to operate, and some of them will even do better than normal. So if you Zoom, you suddenly have many more customers. And if you are Vodacom, you have much more data usage. But if you are a filling station, you have far fewer cars that come around for filling up. So 30% of businesses doing fine or even better than they were before. Then you have probably about 40% of businesses that will be able to do some kind of low level of activity fairly soon, and or will have a strong balance sheet and will be able to muddle through. And then you have about 20 to 30% of your economy which comes to a dead standstill and which will then eventually go bankrupt if the lockdown lasts long enough. So if you are an airport or an airline or an aeroplane manufacturer, if the lockdown lasts long enough, you are bankrupt. But even if it lasts only 2 or 3 months, your balance sheet comes under severe pressure, meaning you either make debt or you use your cash to stay alive, and then that actually affects you very negatively. So what happens to businesses is that once we come out on the other side of lockdown, not all businesses come out on the other side of lockdown in the first place, so they can't go back to work because they've been liquidated in the meantime, or alternatively, they have a very weak balance sheet and they are very eager to come back and produce and start selling things, but they will still have, they won't take all of their previous personnel back, and they will not invest into new capacity for a fairly long time until they have fixed their balance sheets. So the short way to say that is there will be very low business confidence. The other thing that happens is that for consumers or for individuals, they have the same thing. Roughly 30% will have no problem. In fact, they might even have a little bit of spare cash because they can't spend the way that they would normally spend on holidays and restaurants and so on. Then you'll have about 50% of people who can have some income or a reduced level of income and will survive, but will have their balance sheets impaired. They will use their accumulated cash or their credit facilities will be taken up, and they will come back and they will want to participate again, but not as consumers, more like as producers. And then you have about 30% of people who lose their jobs and who are devastated financially and will take many years to recover from this. So the short way to say this is that you have a very low level of consumer confidence. Now, very low level of business and consumer confidence is the very definition of a deep recession. So what happens is that we eventually emerge from this in the middle of a deep recession. Now, who takes care of a deep recession? Normally the government. So the problem in this is that governments, once they go into the strict form of lockdown, they have to have some kind of relief. Now in South Africa, we were fairly slow to supply it, but we eventually did announce a 500 billion rand relief package. And in the US, we are now ticking at about $3 billion of relief packages and more on the way. Now, this is a little bit like putting a patient into an induced coma. Once you put the patient into an induced coma, you've got to put the glucose drip on quickly, otherwise the patient will die of hunger. So effectively, you are sending money to vulnerable people with no quid pro quo. You're just giving them some relief. And people will use this money mainly to buy food and some level of basic groceries. So that happens first of all, but that is very large numbers. The other thing that happens is, apart from the fact that you have to have this relief packages, your income from tax collapses. So essentially, the debt levels of governments worldwide rocket. So in South Africa, we started this crisis with about 60% of GDP of government debt. We are likely to get out of it out of this tax year with about 100% of debt to GDP eventually. So because of the loss of income plus the additional money that we need to spend, there'll be a massive increase in government debt, which will mean that even governments will be reluctant to spend too much money on the other side of this, so that there'll be lots of controversy about government spending, but eventually governments come out of these kind of crises with a greater ability to participate in the economy. So it's likely that governments will spend a lot of money. But what they will do is they will want to spend the money differently once the lockdowns are passed. And it's likely that they will want to strengthen their balance sheets by spending money on infrastructure. Because if you're spending money on relief packages, you spend the money and it's gone. If you're spending money on infrastructure projects, you spend the money and you have some kind of asset on the other side, which you can later privatize or at least will support your economy. Now, what that means is, our basic opinion is that we will not see a V-shaped recovery in the economy. It's something much more akin to a U-shape or even a W-shape, meaning that there will be a quick initial recovery, but then there will be a fallback in the economy again as the low levels of confidence in the economy starts to come back. We're already seeing in a place like China, in Wuhan, which was the first place to lock down, they are having great difficulty in bouncing back because of the very low levels of confidence in consumers and businesses in China even now, but also because their export markets are devastated at the moment. So there's knock-on effects in terms of supply chains, etc., as well, that keeps the economy back. So to get back to it, what we foresee is that the level of production in the world economy doesn't really come back to its 2019 level before roughly 2025. So what we'll see is a gradual recovery fed by massive infrastructure investment from governments between 2021 and 2025 around the world, and nothing like a quick bounce back to the kind of situation that we experienced in 2019.